foundation of last week's lesson. I will recap some of it in case you weren't here. Um, you know, we've been talking about unity. We've had a lot of, and even um, it was Friday night that Brother, what's his name? Herring talked about unity. And then we've talked a lot about soul winning. And I think that's because those two things are very much core to the foundation of what we believe. I personally this year have just had a burning passion, like, God, help me to connect with the members of our body. I mean, hello, it's the name of our class. But also I want to be a soul winner. And I'll be honest with you, you guys know me on a different level because we're in here together every week. And I'm an introvert. Now, once I'm comfortable with you and it's an intimate setting, I'll be silly and funny and, like myself. But when it comes to introducing myself to someone I'm not familiar with, or if I'm in environments that I'm not familiar with, because of my personality style, because of the way my brain is wired, I get awkward and it's horrible. It's paralyzing. And so I have just laid on my face and like cried and been like, God, I need you to help me because I don't want to be awkward. And I'm not asking him to change who he created me to be, but there's a passion in me that says, I've got to connect with people. I've got to be a soul winner. On the flip side of that, as a mom in ministry and everybody, whether it's in work, whatever you do in a day-to-day setting, we are in some way we find ourselves managing others' feelings, and not that we're responsible for them, but in your interaction, if you're even the slightest bit sensitive to someone, you're going to pick up on the things that are happening on visual cues or on things in their voice. And then also we observe other people's choices, the things that they decide to do with their life, and we watch the consequences. And sometimes we're watching the consequences of people we love, and even though we know they kind of asked for it or they kind of like walked themselves into this, it's still difficult to watch them go. And there's something in us that wants to fix it, that says, what can I do? How can I make this better? Sometimes people didn't ask for it. Sometimes bad things happen to the good people that we love very much. And so there's just this, sometimes family members backslide. And sometimes when people walk away from truth, whether it's a family member, someone we are close to, it feels personal, and it hurts. And sometimes it feels like failure. Like, what could I have done? How could I have intervened? Or it's just our human nature to think, what can I do? And it's not that we're making it about us, but it is just our human nature to be like, what role did I play? How did this, like, what could I do different? Social media, group me, marketing text, group text, email, constant connectivity. We're connected in one way or another. All of it gets overwhelming. All of the managing, all of this stuff that's going on internally, mentally. And so last week we talked about when my heart gets overwhelmed. And I told the Lord, I've sang that song, when my heart gets overwhelmed, lead me to the rock, since I was a kid. And sometimes, or I feel like I'd said it, I'd recited it, but I didn't ever really grasp onto the truth that was there. And so we talked about, lead me to the rock that's higher than I. It's perspective, it's understanding. And that led me to this Bible study of other things that were high or higher. And so we talked about the Tower of Babel, and we talked about how the individuals that ended, or the collection of people that ended up here, they were in the land of Shinar, that they had been told by God to spread out and be fruitful, and instead they settled here in this comfortable, what they felt like was a fruitful area. And we talked about like why, like what causes this, and it was, growth is work, and sometimes it's difficult, sometimes it's scary and uncertain to leave, to move on. Sometimes the here and now is more comfortable and it's more comforting. And so it's like, oh, well, this place is lush and we have everything we need. And so sometimes when we settle, we get caught up in a distraction rather than seeking after and pursuing God's will. And so I thought it was funny, Brother Herring talked about the descendants of Shem. And he talked about that Shem was, the meaning of Shem is, and it's in truth and in actuality, is meant to be the name, as in the power behind the name of Jesus. But in this situation, these descendants of Shem, rather than representing the name, they decided to create a name for themselves. And they got caught up in this. And well, and they became, I made the kind of a joke, but it's actually in some of the literature that historians said instead of being Shem, they became a sham. They took the name and made it their name. And God's purpose was still done. He changed the language and they were still scattered. But the legacy of those specific, and I'm not saying that's every descendant of Shem, because he talked about the good side of it, but those specific descendants, their legacy became Babel or confusion. And so they settled, they chased the distraction, and they chose comfort over commission. And they also thought that they could reach physically into the presence of God through their own might and ingenuity. But and here's what really stuck out to me there. It is our human nature sometimes to think that we can manufacture a move of God. We can think we know the right songs to sing, we know the right pattern. You know, we sing and then we do this and we pray and we can think that we can follow the plan of A, B, C, D, E, and we can get a move of God. But we can't manufacture a move of God. Anything we create on our own is just empty emotion. It's theatrics. And I'm going to get a little ahead of myself if I'm not careful. But so we talked about the Tower of Babel, and then we talked about high places. And there were negative and positive mentions of high places in the word. But the negative mentions, again, here were groups and individuals who took the idea of prayer and sacrifice and worship, and they mixed in the ideas of the world, the traditions of pagan nations and worldly wisdom. And I don't even know that they did it consciously, but it's like we can circumvent God's plan for how this is supposed to be done. And again, they were attempting to gain the blessings of God. They wanted to reap good things without sowing, or by doing things their way instead of God's way. And so the high places were a perversion of God's plan and an attempt to shortcut. They want to get the good feelings, the emotion of a move of God, without the work of genuine obedience and real sacrifice. Now, there were good mentions of high places. And so I'm going to read 4 verses, and I want you to see if you can spot the commonality. And I am going to kind of skim the verses. I'm not going to get every single word. Habakkuk 3:19, the Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like hinds' feet. He will make me walk upon mine high places. Amos 4:13, he that formeth the mountains, createth the wind, declare unto man what is his thought, making the morn and darkness, treading upon the high places of the earth. The Lord, the God of hosts, is his name. Isaiah 58:14, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. Isaiah 41:18, I will open rivers in high places, and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water, and the dry land springs of water. So we see what the theme is here. It all starts with him. There's no mention of man being at the center of any of these verses and what's happening in these verses. And so then we talked about the use of eastward in the Bible. And as English-speaking individuals, we process information from left to right. We see time as taking place from the west to the east. Hebrew, however, is written from the right to the left. And so in Jewish thought, that was how time progressed. And so we saw examples throughout the Bible that people who traveled to the east found themselves in trouble or causing trouble. And good things, blessings, help, and salvation seem to come from the east. Traveling to the west, I'm getting ahead of myself, moving to the east was seen as moving away from God to a place that God had already left. And traveling to the west was symbolic of moving into the future in the direction of God's ongoing story. We have to be moving toward a future in God. We don't want to end up like Lot's wife, preserved in one moment because we're afraid to leave behind the comfort of what we know and afraid to leave behind what God's calling us from. And Sister Tiffany brought up an interesting fact that graves are always face the east. And I started thinking, well, I remember my whole life you hear he's going to split the eastern sky when he returns. And Matthew 24:27, and I don't think I wrote that one up there, says that he will come from the east. And so I think it's interesting. The only time we should be facing the east is when we're dead. That's the only time we're going to look toward where he's coming from. Other than that, we need to be going in the direction he's moving. And so, and I thought that something else that was funny is that as I was like recapping all of this and typing out my notes, the song Michael W. Smith, Go West, Young Man, I'd heard that song as a young person, and it was just catchy, When the Evil Go East. And I just thought it was a funny little catchy, like, in other words, don't go the same direction as, no, he knew a thing about what the word says, like, go in the direction God's going. And because he talks about in the song, the heart that's the heart that's going after God, you're going to go west. So how do we go west? So I want to read I'm going to get back to the origin of my lesson. I want to read Psalm 61, 1-3. Oh God, listen to my cry. Hear my prayer. From the ends of the earth, I cry to you for help when my heart is overwhelmed. First thing that stood out to me when I typed this yesterday, and I did pull it up, I think in the NLT, because lately we've been really enjoying the NLT because it's real plain spoken. And I will say again, I always give this disclaimer: if you're looking for doctrine and you're trying to get solid in doctrine and theology of what we believe as far as salvation goes, you always need to refer back to the King James, because there are some things that get lost in translation. But if you're just looking for a good daily reading Bible that's easier to digest, the NLT is a good version. But as I read this, again, I'd always heard the phrase as, when my heart gets overwhelmed, lead me to the rock. But when you read it in this version, and I want to say that it's like this in other versions, and I had not picked up on it. Verse 2 says, from the ends of the earth, I cry to you for help when my heart is overwhelmed, period. And I thought, that's interesting, because we say, when my heart is overwhelmed, comma, lead me to the rock. So I stopped there and I tried to think about what the psalmist was saying. I cry to you for help when my heart is overwhelmed. God knows our frame. And I think there's a sound of desperation in what David's saying here. Oh God, listen to my cry. Hear my prayer from the ends of the earth. The ends of the earth is like, I've reached my wit's end. I need your help. And he literally says, I cry to you for help when my heart is overwhelmed. Psalm 32:5 says, then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave me the guilt of my sin. God is not caught off guard by what you and I think or feel. And confessing and asking humbly for his help moves the atmosphere. And the enemy knows this. Psychiatry.org says, rumination involves repetitive thinking or dwelling on negative feelings and distress and their causes and consequences. The repetitive negative aspect of rumination can contribute to the development of depression or anxiety and can worsen existing conditions. Ever find yourself ruminating? I'm guilty. The enemy likes rumination because it keeps the vicious cycle going. It makes me think that I have to figure things out on my own and that I have to carry my own burdens. And confession can get a bad rap. My parents came into church when I was 7 years old. Before that, we were Catholic. And we did confession, and it was, you go and you tell all the dirty deeds that you did, and the priest absolves you. And I'm not putting any judgment on any of that. I'm just saying that that was my mental idea of what confession was, is I have to go to somebody and I've got to tell them. But confession is not always outward, overt sins like murder, unfaithfulness, obvious wickedness. Faithlessness is sin. Unbelief is sin. And so 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And I'm putting all this together to say, When I go to the Lord in prayer and I confess what I'm struggling with out loud with my mouth, God's Spirit is drawn to my weakness like a moth to a flame. Something about opening up and getting vulnerable with Him attracts Him to me. I suggest try it. Be fiercely vulnerable with Him and see how quickly He comes rushing in. I will tell Him, God, I'm confessing that I am having some really ugly feelings about so and so right now. And here's my thing, my feelings probably aren't right. My attitude might be wrong. He already knows. It's not hidden from Him. But when I say it out loud, He says, hey, I can do something about that. I can help you. So when I confess to Him, He comes rushing in. And I completely understand not wanting to do that in corporate prayer. I am not suggesting that you go to the prayer room and say, God, I've been struggling with being frustrated with pastor. Please don't do that. Like, use wisdom. There is something to tact and keeping your private business private. But when you are in your private alone time with God, I do suggest, like, say those things out loud. Be raw, be vulnerable with Him. And so I think that when we do that, then we'll get to the rest of this psalm and we'll kind of understand how it all comes together. And so Psalm 61 again. Oh God, listen to my cry, hear my prayer. From the ends of the earth, I cry to you for help when my heart is overwhelmed. Now, after the period, he says, lead me to the towering rock of safety, for you are my safe refuge, a fortress where my enemies cannot reach me. So he's saying, you lead me to what's safe, to what's good. You protect me. And as I was praying about this lesson and I kept meditating on this passage and being like, okay, I know, God, you draw me this for a reason. Help me to understand. All of a sudden, God brought another scripture to mind. And so it led me to Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds a house, the workers of the builders is wasted. The work of the builders is wasted. Unless the Lord protects a city, guarding it with sentries will do no good. It is useless for you to work so hard from early morning until late at night, anxiously waiting for food to eat, for God gives rest to His loved ones. Children are a gift from the Lord. They are a reward from Him. Children born to a young man are like arrows in a warrior's hands. How joyful is the man whose quiver is full of them. He will not be put to shame when he confronts his accusers at the city gates. Did anybody feel like, wait, children, what happened here? Because the Lord kept reminding me, unless the Lord builds a house, they that labor, labor in vain. That's the King James Version. And so I went to this passage and I'm reading, and then all of a sudden I looked like children are a gift from the Lord. And I'm like, okay, what is happening here? Like, we shifted gears hard. Like, where are you going with this psalmist? But I think there's an interesting connection. As I opened up the commentary, they pointed out that it's talking about building a house. But building a house can also be seen as building a family. And so the psalmist was talking about building a life. That if we labor and we work towards this building a life, and that encompasses our families, and it encompasses our careers, and it encompasses ministry, we put work, we pour ourselves into all of these things. And the enemy can sometimes take what God meant to be a blessing, and in this case, he was talking about children, and make it feel like a burden. Because let's all be honest, all of those things, family, career, ministry, they can, some days it's like, I love this, my life is amazing, this is fun. And then some days it's like, I don't know how I'm going to carry all of this. It's overwhelming. The psalmist wasn't discouraging against laboring. He wasn't discouraging against working hard or rising early, because the Bible makes it very clear that we reap what we sow, that we must work hard, that we have to be diligent. The point the psalmist was making is without God's involvement, without His favor, that all of our labor is just labor. That all of that ingenuity is just babble or confusion if He's not in the midst of it, if He's not leading us. A Latin motto says, Nisi Dominus Frusta, and it comes from the first words of this psalm, and it means without the Lord, frustration. Our heart's cry has to be, lead me to the rock. Aimless wandering, settling will cause us to miss out on what God has for us. The work is my job. The worry and the micromanaging is not. When I follow after God's leading, the work is my job, but the outcome is His. Do you know how you will know where He's leading and how you will hear His voice? I'm laughing because I'm thinking y'all are going to be like, oh, here we go again. But let me back up. Pastor taught a few weeks ago on Tuesday night, and he was talking about how it's important for us to understand theology because everyone is responsible for knowing the Word. And he talked about that, he said, the vast majority of us don't enjoy theology. And please don't take any of what I'm saying as contradicting what he was saying, because I'm not in any way. But that I turned to Jason and I'm like, I love theology. And he's like, I know. And Maggie was sitting in front of us and she turned around and she said, that's because you're a weirdo. And we all kind of laughed about it. But it's been like a little bit of a burr in my saddle because I felt like I totally got what he was saying. And Maggie even said, well, Mom, that's great, but you're a nerd and you understand what you're reading. But I didn't always. And I did develop a love for the Word as a young, uneducated child. And so I was thinking through all of this, and I told him, I said, you know, I've been praying and asking the Lord to help me with this because I have a passion for sharing my love for the Word and sharing my love of theology. And I said, I thought about something. If a man proposes marriage and a woman says, this is a good idea because he's got a good job and he makes good money and he can provide me with all the things I need. And he can give some physical comfort as well and some physical fulfillment. And she only marries him for what he can do for her. But he says, hey, I had a hard day and I want to talk about it. Or, hey, this is my philosophy on child. And she says, I'm not interested in that. Like, but hey, we need groceries. Hey, can you give me a back rub? And all she's interested in is what he can physically do for her. It's not a relationship. It's a purchase. It's bartering. She has to want to know him. Well, the Word says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And so if we only want what feels good, if we only want what he can do for us, I want him to heal me. I want him to save my family. I don't want to go to hell. I want him to save me. But I don't really need to know him. It's good. I can come here and Pastor can tell me about him. Would you want to be married to somebody that only wanted to know about you what someone else could, an acquaintance could tell you about you? And so if we want to know him, we have to know the Word. And I realize that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to skip through some of this. There was an article by Lifeway Research, and I plan to read more information to you, but 40,000 individuals from 8 to 80 were surveyed. And people who read the scriptures 1 or 2 times a week showed no impact on their life. People who read them 3 times a week showed a slight impact. So you would think that 4 times would be like gradually more, right? But here's the thing. When someone goes, and I thought it was interesting because 3 times a week, that would be like coming to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Tuesday night. You've heard scripture 3 times, right? And you haven't really had to put any effort into it. 4 times a week, when people went from 3 to 4 times a week, all of a sudden there was a exponential growth in the impact on their life. And again, the researchers thought there would be this like steady incline, but it went. And feeling lonely drops 30%. Anger issues drop 32%. Bitterness in relationships drops 40%. Alcoholism drops 57%. Sex outside of marriage drops 68%. Feeling spiritually stagnant drops 60%. Viewing pornography drops 61%. Sharing your faith jumps 200%. Discipling others jumps 230%. So I can come to you, and I will every week, or not, it may not be me every week. My point is you can come to this class every week and someone's faithfully going to stand here, and we might teach you life skills, and we might teach you even psychology lessons, and we're going to teach you all these things that are definitely applicable to your daily life. And please don't stop coming. But if you develop a genuine hunger for the word and a habit for prayer and daily Bible reading, and you couple that with your confession to him about what's going on, you're going to be able to see very tangible results. And you're also going to begin to get a revelation of your own that you can share with others. And so sometimes, I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I think, especially like Pastor will talk about 2-degree change, and Jason was mentioning this yesterday. Pastor will talk about 2-degree change, and I'll think, what's that one thing that I can do that's going to move the needle where X is concerned? Here's the thing. Developing an appetite for the word and that daily reading, again, this is not something we're talking about hours, like 10, 15 minutes, but developing an appetite and doing that every single day is a tangible way that you can make a very significant change in your life that will literally change your life. And it will have almost immediate results. Like you're going to, within days, go, oh, something's changing, something's happening. And here's the other side of that, because Maggie made the thing about it's difficult sometimes. When you read it repetitively, and start with an easier version like the NLT, but when you read it repetitively, all of a sudden you develop understanding and it gets easier. And pretty soon you're like, and it's the same thing with anything that we want to learn, because I went through high school and I had to put in very little effort to make good grades. It was just, I'm naturally nerdy. I remember things I hear, and I'm good with logic. So a lot of times I could pass a test based on logic and not even really know what was happening. When I went back to college in my 30s and 40s, and I opened a textbook, I was like, hold up, I just read a whole page and I have no idea what I read. And I had to read and reread. But after I'd done that for a few weeks, I got back to that being able to read very quickly and process the information, because your brain is like a muscle, and the more you exercise it, it gets better. And we're completely out of